The coronavirus has spread rapidly across the world. Officials believe that it all started in Wuhan, China. It's believed that the virus may have originated from a market in the city where people can buy an assortment of wild game meat. And an article in the New York Times puts the spotlight on that market and others like it in China. Stephen Lee Myers wrote that article, and he is the Beijing bureau chief for the New York Times, and he joins me now via Skype. So thank you so much for joining us. I think, everyone who's been watching this story.
Wet markets, but here they're where people go and buy their produce, their fruits, their vegetables, their meat, their eggs, almost everything. They're quite popular. Some of them are more exotic. They sell live animals, live wildlife, and particularly game that you wouldn't normally see in a supermarket. Wildlife in these markets. They regulate 54 species, some of them quite exotic, some of them familiar to us, like partridges or wild turkeys, all manner of wildlife you can find in some of these markets. They are regulated. There was an inspection in the particular market in Wuhan just a few months ago, and they found no irregularities there.
All right, so let's talk about that market. Now, I know that authorities are still really trying to zero in on the sort of the starting point for this virus, but they have been looking at this particular market in Wuhan. Why do they think that the coronavirus might be linked to this market?
What happened is in December, there were treatment. And what they found in the late days of December was that a lot of these people were from that particular market in Wuhan, where there were these live animals being sold. And that was the first signal that there was an epidemic emanating from one spot. Once they figured that out and they isolated the virus, they ended up tracking it to a virus that's been exposed before, that's exposed humans before, from bats. And the belief is, like the SARS epidemic, 17 years ago, that the virus that was in bats jumped to a mammal, and then from mammals to humans, and all of this happened in this one particular market.
Okay, so then how have authorities sort of responded to this? We've seen video where it looked like the market was shut down and kind of cordoned off.
Well, at first, I think the authorities in Wuhan weren't quite sure what they were facing, but once they realized that there were so many victims from one market, on New Year's Day, January 1st, they ordered that market shut down, and they sent in police and health workers, workers in hazmat suits who disinfected the market. They cleaned it up and everything, and then began to investigate the links that I just described. At that point, they still weren't quite sure what the link was, but since then they've established that the coronavirus did come from bats, and that it was most likely transmitted through some other animal that was sold there.
Completely shut down. At the end of the day, we're talking about small businesses. I'm sure they don't make a lot of money. We're talking about merchandise that, may spoil if you don't sell it quickly. Have you talked to any of the locals or any of the vendors about all of this?
I've talked to vendors both there and in other parts of China, and the people who sell this kind of produce, the wildlife, are quite defensive about this. People really like this kind of game, wild meat, live particularly, that they can eat as fresh as possible. And a lot of them, I think, are somewhat in denial about the fact that it could have been the source. The fact is that the government, even after they shut that market, didn't do anything about the trade in wildlife. wildlife in any market anywhere in China until they figure out what happened in this epidemic.
So listen, you mentioned SARS, which was linked to markets like this. You know, that was a really big deal. We covered it the same way as we're covering the coronavirus. Any changes made post-SARS to make sure something like this doesn't happen?
You know, that's a complicated question to answer. On one level, in terms of the markets, actually not much has changed. Once they figured out that the SARS virus came through a similar path from at that point, they didn't even realize it was a bat, but from an animal called the civet. They shut the market or the trade down in civets, which is and this trade in wildlife, you know, has continued for the last 17 years. In this case now, I think they're looking at whether, I mean, I should say that the Chinese scientific community, the public health system, has made great strides since then. That was 17 years ago. They are doing a much better job in sharing information with the scientific community, which is why in this case, unlike SARS, they've been able to identify the outbreak and publicize it much more quickly than they did.
All right, Stephen Lee